I would like to talk to you today about, it's a little bit of a mouthful, accessibility spec-driven component development. And that's just something that I found really pleasing recently. Like just by coincidence, I had to implement a component, and I took this approach, and really felt good. So I thought, why not share the feeling with you? I would like to start by, you should imagine that there's a very common scenario for you as a front-end developer. I guess most of you are. I think there's a bunch of native developers here, but maybe you can imagine you build for the web, and the designer comes in, and there's a huge task to implement a combo box. And of course, these days you might reach for one of these off-the-shelf solutions for this, especially if it just looks like that. But there is certain space there where it will be so custom, the requirements, that it might actually make more sense to implement your own. And that's sort of the scenario that we'll be discussing today. So the way you, or at least I usually approach this in the past, was my task list would be something like this, right? We get the design specs, then we do styling and markup, we sprinkle some behavior on top of it, and then at the end, we check accessibility, is it accessible? And that has some issues of its own, but the biggest issue is that usually it doesn't really look like that, right? I mean, when it comes to it, it more looks like this, right? So get a picture of a dropdown. It's not really a design spec, right? It's this is how it should look like. If you're lucky and you have a design team that sort of is experienced, and they will give you more detailed spec. But usually it's a picture of a dropdown. Then you do style the diffs, right? That's sort of a little bit of a stigma of React, I think. Some people say React cannot be accessible, it's just diffs. But that's a little bit silly, but that's what sometimes happens. Right, then you spend a lot of time crafting the best code, putting all your sagas in there and crafting, you sort of come up with the behavior yourself, right? I mean, okay, it should probably open when you click, and when you click the option, it should be selected and things like that. But you spend a lot of time. That's sort of the bulk of the work, right? This is the thing you're doing, and that's your craft. And then accessibility, if you have time, you will check if I tap for the page, does the focus work? Especially if you in a environment like a startup environment, for example, that's not usually the most important things, right? It should work for most of the users. It doesn't have to work for all of the users. And I'm not here to shame anyone here, because I've been doing that myself. I probably do this thing even in my current work, and it's just if you take this approach, then it's very easy to fall into this, I think. But recently, when I got this task of basically implementing that, then I thought let's maybe reverse this process a little bit and start with something different than just the design spec, and start with the accessibility spec. So then your process can look something like that, right? I mean, you have a widget. You try to identify, okay, this actually falls into this specific pattern. Then you look up what is the spec for that pattern, what sort of interactions would the user expect from this kind of thing. From that, you get markup, you add the behavior, and at the end, you have the semantic markup and behavior, and then it's fairly easy to style it. And you might ask a question why is accessibility important? And that talk won't be about this. I think there's plenty of materials out there for you to sort of get a feeling. There's plenty of people on Twitter praising accessibility, plenty of people shaming other people for not being accessible. One story that I can tell is that I have a lot of friends who are civil engineers. And I've recently talked to some of them. They're my age, and they had an exam. And I'm why do you have an exam? You've been working for 5 years or something like that, right? And the exam is so that they can get a license to actually do some kind of projects, right? When we look at what we do, we don't do licenses, right? We just split code, and like everyone can do it. But when you have these civil engineering tests, like they have these like very detailed questions about, I don't know, what's the minimum distance from a window to a like gas oven or something like that, like 1 meter in Poland, apparently. And like when you take it, like the accessibility specs is sort of that for us, right? And we don't have to take exams, and we don't have to pass these exams to actually do that. But like I can imagine a future where you have to, right? Because like websites become more and more sort of a thing that can create real damage, right? So there will be a moment maybe where people will realize that this is actually really important. So if we like get on that task of building a combo box, like what would we actually need? So we need this vi aria spec. Like how many of you have heard about this vi aria? Yeah, just a few people. So this is like W3 org. It's like a body that creates specs for the web. It's like a non-profit organization, and they have this accessibility interaction spec that we can open here. So you can see here, maybe if I zoom a little bit, they have design patterns and widgets, and that's like, there's a lot of them. Like this, basically, these people observe how the web platform evolves, and they see, okay, there is a pattern called dialog, right? It opens, and then they figure out, okay, what are the things that we need to have there so that it's accessible for everyone, and so that it's like a baseline for accessibility. And of course, accessibility is sort of like a term where you can put a lot of things, like, I don't know, what kind of colors make contrast so that people can read it. I don't know, even copy can be accessibility as well, right? What kind of label do you have actually on the button, right? That's also falls into accessibility, but this is more about keyboard interactions, about the screen readers, so support for people with some kind of eyesight problems, but it also caters for power users that might be like not using a mouse, but maybe doing everything with a keyboard. And here, if we look, there is a thing called combo box, which is a fancy name for that pattern that our designer asked us to do. And here, if we like, that's a long read, right? Like you can go, and there's all sorts of different types of this pattern, and then you have like keyboard interactions specified. You might have some more keyboard interactions. Then you might have some like, what sort of attributes do I need to put on different pieces of the markup? And that's like, it's a long read. And if we had exams, this is the material, right? But there is also these very handy examples that can get you pretty far. So this is a page for combo box for examples. So they usually have like a very simple pure JavaScript implementation of this. So for example, like this is a very rudimentary fruit selector. And there is like more stuff here. Very interestingly, there is like a description of the markup, description of keyboard interaction. So this, for example, what happens when the user presses arrow down when focused on text box or something like that. Or what happens when a user presses escape when focused on one of the items. And like you have sort of like a recipe for what the interaction should be. So you don't have to guess, you can just read up, and then assuming like everyone follows this, right, then all websites will be sort of predictable and nice to interact with. Another thing is that there's like a very detailed description of the markup that you need. So there's an element that you should use for example, this is the combo box container, right? This should be a div, that's fine. It should actually have a role of combo box. And there is a few like aria prefixed attributes that you should put on that. Some of them are like ID references. That means it has to refer an ID of a different element inside that component. So that's sort of like internal references. Some of them like flip. Then you have a text box as well. That's an input type text. that might have like some more area here. And the list pop-up, which is like this thing that pops up below, that's in the UL, and it has some li items inside, and they also have roles. And even more interestingly, they have like just the basic markup to look at, and we'll take this. So you can see like what kind of elements compose this accessible combo box, right? So you have a label, it's a little bit outside, and then you have this combo box wrapper, which is a div, and inside there is another div, which holds the input and the arrow button. And here, after all of this, you have the UL, and presumably, if you have some options, there is some LIs in there as well. And like one way of going about implementing something like that would be TDD, which is test-driven development. And these days there's very nice tools for doing that for this kind of components. For example, there is the React testing library, which is not only popular because of very like searchable name, it's actually a very good library as well. Like from the people behind this library, there's also two additional libraries called JSDOM and user event. JSDOM adds some more powerful assertions to your Jest testing framework. So you can assert on like things inside the DOM. Like for example, like does it have that attribute, right? You don't have to do much to answer that question, right? And then the user event is a nice little library that allows you to simulate user interactions that are very close to what an actual user would do, right? An example would be a user typing. Like if you just like trigger some synthetic events, right? That would be like just a stream of types, right? What this library will do, it will actually like sort of type with a little bit of delay, maybe a random delay or something like that. So it's more close to the actual like browser. Like these tests don't run in a browser; they run in Node, like with a fake DOM. But this will take it pretty close. But it will not take it all the way. And like there will be an example, I think, in what we'll go through where this is a little bit misaligned. So like one lesson would be always test in real browser, and maybe also if you have opportunity test with something like Cypress or Selenium that actually runs in real browsers, but maybe you don't have to have that kind of thorough test, right? It's just like test if your money-making flow works. So we've been through some of these, right? I mean, I will not be fooling you. I don't know exactly what this means, right? Like I haven't read all of this, but I know that this is required to make this accessible, right? And like I sort of play along, and I just do what I'm told to do. But like this is just a few that needs to be here, and there is like way more for different types of patterns. So usually like. You can be an expert in accessibility, and that's probably like a full-time job that you could have. Yeah, and then as advertised, we'll attempt a live coding session, and I hope that you can see. I'm not exactly sure. Probably people here will see. Like the further we go, the less it will be clear. But we can start by looking. Okay, what do we have in this project here? It's just a create React app, basically clean install. I added two files, which is the combo box, that will be our combo box component, and then we have the tests, which will, not surprisingly, hold some tests. And then this environment I'm using here is called Code Sandbox, and it actually has like a nice test runner built in. So it like detects, okay, we have some tests, and then just runs them. So the first thing we can try to do is go here, right, and like copy paste this code, and return it from our component. And this is HTML that's like not one-to-one translatable to JavaScript, and I will save you the pain of seeing me change it. So I'll just like copy paste this, so we can return this instead. And we have some values I need to change. So of course our our component here will need to get some props, right? So we can already see, okay, I'm gonna need a label, and I'm gonna need like ID passed, and I'm gonna need this trigger label, which is just like something for users that want to like read this button, basically, right? Because it's a button that holds an SVG, which is like an arrow. So if you have a screen reader, you wouldn't be able to know what this arrow actually means, right? So it's nice to give like a trigger label, and we can just give like a default value here, so that you don't have to always specify it. Something like C options should do it. So now we have some like markup that basically is copied from area specs with all our roles set up. That we can work from. So one thing that I would like to point your attention to is that like there is an error in my like a warning in my environment here, and it says like elements with the array role combo box must have the following attributes defined. There's like 2 of them, and this is actually incorrect, right? I mean, I took it from the spec, so like I know this is not true. So like one advice is like not blindly follow what, for example, an ESLint rule will tell you. Like you can always verify that with the spec. So now what we can do is turn our attention to tests and attempt some like test-driven development. So one thing we're gonna need. I'm just gonna copy some code here. So we'll need some dependencies. So we're requiring the React testing library, the user event library, and the JSDOM library. And JSDOM is just like a effectful import, because it extends your expect sort of variable to give you more assertions. And we need to add these dependencies, which I forgot to do. So user event, and we need to also add React testing library, and we need to add JSDOM. All right, so now we have these 3. And what we can do now is we can spend a little bit of time thinking like what should be the final API for our component, right? We have this label ID and trigger label, but there will probably be like more. For sure, we need the options, right? Because we need to select, like show some options to select from, and we need like this is React, so we need a function to call whenever a user selects something, right? That's usually like the direction that the data flows in React. So we need to pass methods. So just to brush it up, we can put this public interface, have some TypeScript types also to augment that. Right, so this should be good. So what we have is the ID, we have the label, we have the trigger label, but now we also have options and the onChange method, right? The onChange takes an option, returns nothing, and the option is just like a small data structure here that has a string label. That's what will be displayed to the user, and it has an ID, which will be like a unique value. So now in our test, we can add a first test. So for sure, we need to pass something to our component here. So we can have some fruits. That was a fruit selector. So we can pass some options. Right. We also need an ID. We needed a label. That was basically what we needed, as everything else is optional, right? And then like our test doesn't do much, right? It's just like basically a no-op. So we can add a first test which will verify that when I render the dropdown, then it's closed, right? We don't want it to be open by default. And we can see how a test like that might look like. So what we're doing here is we're using the React testing library to render the component. We're getting back like a bag of stuff. If someone used Enzyme before, I think this was called wrapper, but that's not the case in React testing library. It's just like some utils. And for example, one of these utils is like get by role. And here we can sort of find these elements in our rendered component by looking at their like role attribute, right? So if we go back here, you can see, okay, there's a role combo box and there's a role list box. So we're basically grabbing for this UL and for this div. Now we can have a hold of it, right? And then what we do after we have that, then we can assert, okay, first of all, we want to be sure that the area expanded is false, because that's what sort of conveys outside that is closed, and we also want to be sure that the list box is empty, right? Both of these assertions, they come from this jest DOM library. They're not in jest by default. But basically, it's like the list box element has nothing inside of it, right? And that's more or less what we coded here. So the test should probably be passing. Let's see. Yeah, so there's a reason why this fails, and that is the way the React testing library works. So it basically appends to the DOM. So every time I run these tests, it creates more and more of these combo boxes, right? That's what it says here. Found multiple elements of role combo box, and they actually expose a nice little utility called cleanup that you can run. Then we use the jest after each functionality, and we can say, okay, after each, just do a cleanup. And then if we run this and refresh, then our tests are passing now. That's cool. But of course, I mean, there isn't much to it, right? I mean, we always render false here, and then we never render any elements in here. So like, there's no surprise that it passes. So we should probably add some options here, right? So we'll take our options, and then we'll map over them. We'll get an option. Or maybe I'll close some of this. So for each option, we'll want a li element, because that's what Aria told us, right? We go back here, we remember Aria told us there is an option li element for each option, and then it has this Aria selected, which is true only if the element is selected, of course. But first rule is that they should have a role of option, so we just, again, follow blindly. We just say role is option. Of course, we'll want to render some label here. And yeah, this is actually correct, right? In this case, they know what they're talking about, because they need an RS selected. And we'll start with just this being false. And because it's React, we also need a key. So that will be the option ID. So we're pretty good here. But of course, that makes our test fail, because suddenly we are not empty here. And what we need here is a bit of state, right? Because suddenly we have a state which is open and close, and there is a nice new API in React to add state, which is hooks, and we can just say is open, right? That's whether the dropdown is open or not. And we'll just do React use state, and we'll start with a closed dropdown. Then we can use that value here in the area expanded, so that already gives us this like dynamic area expanded attribute here, right? And then we can also say only render these options if it's open, and we're back to passing test. So I think that's pretty cool that we can do these TDD tests. So I think a way to approach this now could be, let's just add more of these tests and then try to make as many of them pass as we can in the time that we have. So this is actually not like it works, but it actually renders initially a closed dropdown, right? You might like make more assertions here. You might also do a snapshot because I think that's a nice place for it. Unfortunately, the code sandbox doesn't allow snapshots, so we'll pass that here. But we can add a second test for like some kind of interaction, and that will be this test. So when we focus the input field, right, we open the dropdown. And that's not what these dropdowns here do. Like when I focus, I go to an example. If I just focus on it, it doesn't actually open. I have to click here. But I read the spec, and it doesn't really say you shouldn't do that. So, and I think it's a nicer experience. So I'll just choose to do it. So again, we render. We get these utils. Then we select. Now we have 3 elements that we're interested in. We use another one of these things from the bag of tricks. We get by label text. And that actually selects our input. And that is because if we go back here, the input is labeled by the label, right? So this is sort of, it's a little bit tricky, but what it forces you to think about is how people see it if they actually don't see the screen, they just like read it, right? And because there is like a reference, cross-reference between them, then actually this input will read to the person looking at it. It will actually say select fruit, and then we use that event user event library to simulate a click on that input. So if we just go here, I'm just gonna add. So we also render it in the browser, right? But we don't have any options here. So let me just copy these options so that we have a little bit of visual here, right? And then take this basically. We also need an ID. Right? So I would like this to open. But it doesn't, and that's why our test fails. Here it says R expanded true. This is what I expected, but it actually got false. And we also, so that's the assertions we're doing here, right? And then another assertion is that the list box has actually should be 3, right? Because that's how many we have here. So let's go and implement this. We should probably have some kind of on focus event here. And that's a function that sets the state to open. There isn't much to it, right? And then that's on our input field. And now the test passes, and we can also see when I click it, we see some options. Although it doesn't work sort of probably as we expect, which like it doesn't hide it when we blur, so we can add a test for that. But before we do that, maybe let's look a little bit how this starts to look, right? So we basically do the same thing in both tests, and we can sort of predict that that's what's going to happen in each of them, right? Because that's sort of our setup for the test, right? We render it. We don't really change the options. If we start doing that, we can maybe have some kind of setup that has options, right? And then we always look for these elements to do something with them. So that's like an opportunity for optimization. So we can do a nicer test setup. So let me just paste a bunch of code here. So ignore that. Here, right? So I extracted all that initial code into a function that is called setup. And you can see it still renders the combo box. It has another one of the options, which is called onChange. That's just a function that I can observe and assert on that comes from jest. And then I'm doing like all the stuff that I've been doing before. I added another one, which is trigger, this arrow. And then I return all of it from that function. So then in my tests now, which are here, I can just call utils setup, right? And I get a bunch of stuff. For example, utils.input, that's still my input. I've also created a few of these even more high-level assertions that I can speak in a language that when I read these tests, I understand what these assertions actually mean, right? For example, I want to assert that the dropdown is closed, right? If we look at the implementation of this, this is basically what we had before, right? And the same thing, assert that the dropdown is open. We have an additional options here to say how many options I expect to see there. But that's basically what we had before in these tests, right? And then I have a few more, like assert no option is selected. We'll get there, and then assert the input value, and assert that the option is selected. So like now our tests read much more like just a spec. So in a way, I could maybe go back to these ARIA spec, and if I'm like very thorough, right, then I could more or less copy what they say and just change it into code. So now that we have this, we can add all of the other tests. And don't get scared, there's a few of them. I'm not sure if I copied the initial ones as well. Yeah, so let's just remove this. And if we look now at the tests, yeah, so we have the ones that we build to are passing, and we have 14 failed. We'll not make 14, so don't worry. But I can just show you like what kind of tests we can do, right? Blaring, of course. Then we have like opening the button when I click on the toggle icon. Maybe I can close the drop-down and select the option and actually trigger the callback event when I select an option in a drop-down. Should be like by clicking, because that's what we do here. All right, and we can go through this test. It's a little bit more elaborate. Again, the setup, right? Then we do a user event, which is click. Right, so we do click, and then we take the first element with a role of option, and then we click on it. Now nothing happens because we haven't implemented it, but the point is it should actually do all these three things, right? It should close the dropdown, it should select that option, and it should trigger a callback. And that's what we assert on here, right? That our function that is sort of our public interface within the code, it has been called one time, and it has been called with this particular option that we clicked, right? And also that there is a option selected sort of internally, that we check by looking at this area selected. And then we also assert that the input actually holds the label, because if we go back here, right, if I select an option, then it has that option. Like, funny enough, I actually noticed that this is broken, right? If I go and select cabbage, it selects apple. So even they have problems with implementing stuff like that. Yeah, I don't know what the lesson is here. Yeah, going back to this, it's like we also assert that dropdown is closed. Of course, when we select an option, it should close. And then, like, sort of a small after test is like, okay, what happens when you click it again? There should be only one option, and that option should be selected. So if you look here, that's basically this behavior, right? So there's more. Okay, when I start to type, right, I should select that first option and filter the dropdown, right? So if I go start typing A, then it has only the option starting with A. So we test for that. One I skip for some reason, so I'll skip that here as well. Maybe when I press enter while typing, it should also select the option, right? So here for pressing the enter, actually the user event library actually doesn't provide that functionality of triggering custom keys. So it's only like typing. So for that we use the default React testing library functionality, which they have like key down, right? And then you can say, I want to key down on this input, and then an enter event is just like a bunch of objects that I have up here. Right? It describes an sort of enter key. Going back, yeah, then I assert on like what you would expect. Pressing the up and down arrow, that should sort of cycle through the options. Selecting the highlighted option should close the dropdown if you press the enter like while sort of cycling through the options, right? So that would be equivalent to doing this. Then yeah, cycling up and down, clearing the selection if we press escape. That's also something that the ARIA spec requires. When you have a selection and you blur out, you also want to sort of select. So there's all sorts of these things here. And I don't know how much time we have. Like 5-ish minutes. All right, let's try to do a few of them maybe. So like we had that blur functionality that's sort of not that interesting, but we can do maybe the typing. That would be something like on change here, right? So when the value of the input changes, we don't want to do some key down, right? Because, for example, I can right-click and paste. That's also a change, right? And we want to trigger the same kind of event. Actually, I also already have an on change here, so let's call it on input change. And let's say const on input change. All right, we get some event, and that the next input value, that would be e dot target dot value. So one thing that we want to do when we type, like suddenly we want to have control over the input as well, right? So because we want to, for example, filter the options, right? So we need to have that value set to something. Let's call it input value. That's another bit of state that we'll need to have. Just call it input value and then set input value. And we want to start with just nothing. Right, so when someone types, for sure we want to sort of unbreak the typing. Another thing we want to do is do this filtering, right? So that's again a bit of state, right? So we suddenly don't show all the options, but just some of them. So we could say visible options and set visible options, right? And then we would also have we'll use the state and start with options, right? That's our beginning, and then we, instead of using all the options, we'll just map over the visible options. And then I will not do that here, but I can maybe copy it from here. Oh. So when we do the input change, right, we want to do this. We were here, yes. So we basically want to filter over all our options and only select the ones that begin with the lower case of the thing that was typed, right? And then we want to set that as the visible options, right? We also want to select if there is a option still remaining, sort of in the available next visible options. Then we want to select that option, right? That's sort of the behavior that we have here. If I type B, right, then banana is selected. And just like a side note, this has also this behavior of like finishing the word, and I chose not to implement that. There is actually a ARIA distinction here, and that's if I had that this value of autocomplete would be both, right? Because I chose not to implement that particular behavior, then that value is just list. And then just to make it faster, we also have this, right, which is we select and notify, and that function is fairly simple. So we call select and notify with that first option or nothing if it doesn't exist. And then we first of all set selected. That's one piece of state that we're still missing. The selected item. Selected. Set selected. We start with nothing. So we select that option, and if the callback is passed, then we also change it, right? And then if we're lucky, then maybe one more test. Still not. We're missing something. Let's see.
You need to use the selected item.
The selected item, yeah, that's true. That's a good point. So, for example, what would we use it for? So we have this active descendant, right? That should actually point to the selected item. But this is an ID ref, and we don't have any IDs on these, so we actually need to add an ID for each item. And that would be we can be free here, but it has to be unique, right? So maybe we'll say it's an ID of the entire combo box, then an option, and then the ID of that option. Right, and then we need to finish this. Oh. Yeah, so now we have an ID, right, and we can here inside the active descendant basically say if there is a selected item, right, then we take this one with this ID, otherwise it stays null, right? So that should fix our active descendant. We also have the ARIA selected here for that item, right? So now here we also can say if there is a selected item, then we take and. So we basically want to say if there is a selected item and the selected ID is equal to the current option ID, that's when this item is selected, right? And maybe that's enough now. Yes, we have one more passing, and that is the I'm not sure if we can actually display the passed one here. Maybe not. But we're one step closer, right? And basically what you can do is sort of progressively work your way towards like fully passing spec. And what you will end up with is something like this, where you have all of them passing, and you can just see how it looks without any styling, because styling, that's actually like the last thing we do, right? So like that still basically looks like what we had before, right? But it's a fully functional drop down here, so I can sort of go for these options. It sort of wraps around, so I still press arrow down, right? I can escape. That makes it unset and things like that, right? So it's all sort of working, but we worked our way from the accessibility spec and not the other way around. So I think this is probably an approach that it's hard to convince yourself to start with, because like just if you look at like the amount of these specs, right, there's a lot of these interactions. And for example, if you take a library off the shelf, then you can count that most of these will be already sort of done by the community for you, right? But if you really need to implement something custom, and also if you need to implement any of these, and there isn't a library for all of them, right? Then it's a okay approach to make sure that you get this accessibility from grounds up and not as sort of an afterthought after you're done with the visual stuff. And that's all I had.